It's a privilege and a pleasure to welcome you here this evening on behalf of the Huntington and our many partners in tonight's enterprise. You are in for an imaginative time in the presence of two remarkable scholars. Before turning to the main event, a few quick thank yous are in order. Warmest thanks to the Huntington's Director of the Library, David Zeidberg, and its Director of Research, Steve Hindle, both of whom embody the partnership ethos here at this remarkable institution. Thanks to Taryn Haydostian of the Institute on California in the West, and to the Huntington's Hallie Prater, Amanda Greenberger, Sarah Krupczak, and Lauren McLaughlin. This event this evening is the inaugural event of 6 California celebrations of ideas and magnificent works, all done in commemoration of the centennial of the Pulitzer Prize. The organization shepherding the 6 programs and bringing each to the widest audiences possible is California Humanities, our state arm of the National Endowment for the Humanities. From California Humanities, I want to thank Aaron Meny and other staff colleagues for their help, and I would like those board members, past and present, from California Humanities to signal their unstinting support of the humanities by waving their hands. Thank you. Most especially, let me now turn to Julie Fry, President and CEO of California Humanities, who has done so much to make tonight and its 5 companion events spring to life. Please join me in welcoming Julie to the podium.
Thank you, Bill. We're so delighted to see all of you here tonight. Thank you, welcome. Thank you to the Huntington for being such an amazing partner as we start out our On the Road with California Humanities. We are, as Bill said, the statewide nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And we deliver programs and make grants across the state to help us all understand each other better. And we've been doing that for 40 years. So as part of our celebration of our 40th anniversary, we're also joining with the National Endowment for the Humanities to celebrate their 50th anniversary and, of course, the centennial of the Pulitzer Prize. And so we are looking forward to traveling around the state. We invite you to come on the road with California Humanities as we embark on our year of celebrations. We couldn't do it without Bill Deverell. This evening is all because of him, I have to say, and we're excited to hear him talk with our learned colleagues. So welcome, and over to you, Bill.
Thanks, Julie. So let us now turn to our main event. It's immensely fitting that an evening devoted to scholarship and interpretations of the American past take place here at the Huntington, one of the most remarkable research libraries on the face of the globe. We're going to turn our attention to those 2 scholars leaning against the wall over there. Elizabeth Fenn is Elizabeth, who goes by Lil. Fenn is the Walter and Lucienne Driscoll Professor of Western American History and Department Chair at CU Boulder. She received her PhD from Yale. She is the author of Pax Americana, a troubling and important history of a North American smallpox epidemic at the time of the American Revolution. Her 2014 book, sweeping book, Encounters at the Heart of the World, A History of the Mandan People, was awarded a Pulitzer Prize in 2015. Alan Taylor is the Thomas Jefferson Professor at the University of Virginia. He received his graduate training at Brandeis University, and like Lil Fenn, he is a scholar of environmental, Native American, Western American, and colonial history. He's the author of 7 books. Alan won his first Pulitzer Prize 2 decades ago for his book William Cooperstown, Power and Persuasion on the Frontier of the Early Republic. His 2013 book, The Internal Enemy, Slavery and War in Virginia, 1772 to 1832, was a finalist for the National Book Award, and in 2014 was awarded the 2nd of Alan's Pulitzer Prizes. Following our conversation between the 3 of us this evening, we'll have time for questions from you all, well, not from all of you, from some of you, and we welcome those. And we'll have time for coffee and cookies outside, and our guests have graciously agreed to sign copies of their books. Please join me now in welcoming 2 of the nation's most talented interpreters of the American past. So, Alan and Lil, Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay? Okay. Thank you so much for being with us. Before we get to the meat of the topic, which is not is history good, but what good is history, let's warm up a little bit. When you were much younger, what did you want to do with your life? Lil?
Are we failures or not?
I was going to be a softball player, or an archaeologist, or a writer.
Okay. Alan?
Well, I wanted to be center fielder for the Boston Red Sox. But there didn't seem to be any demand for my services.
And at what point did you both decide you wanted to be professional historians?
I decided twice.
Right. Can you tell us that story?
Well, the first time I decided was as an undergraduate at Duke University. I believe it was 1980, November of 1980, when verdicts came down acquitting 5 Ku Klux Klansmen of killing 5 Communist Workers' Party members and labor activists in something known as the Greensboro Massacre. And at the time, I was enrolled in my first history class, and I realized that maybe history could explain this to me. So that was the first time I decided to be a historian. And then, I started graduate school and dropped out and had a long walkabout period and was doing manual labor and kind of was burned out with doing manual labor. And a friend of mine, Marjolaine Kars, another historian, gave me a wonderful book to read by a French author named Jean Giono. And the book was called The Horseman on the Roof. It's a book nominally about a cholera epidemic. And it's absolutely beautiful. I was taken with Giono's ability to write something beautiful about something terrible. And that catapulted me back into graduate school to write a book on smallpox.
Alan?
Well, I grew up in a small town in Maine, and I don't think I had the broadest horizons or the greatest ambitions growing up in the small town. And I went off to college, and I was very fortunate in that I had a mentor who was not himself a publishing scholar. I think he published 2 articles in his career. But he was the most phenomenal teacher. When you would see him walking in the hallways, you thought maybe he was the janitor, because this was in rural Maine, and he was just wearing this old coat. But then he would get in front of a class, and he would just light up. And there was just so much intellectual excitement to just listen to him. And he kept up on the literature. He read everything. He knew everything, but he just didn't publish. So it was the excitement of working with him, and then the encouragement that he gave me. He said, I ordinarily don't encourage people to go to graduate school because the odds of getting a job were pretty bad at that time. And but he said, I think you might have a chance. So I never would have dared to have gone to apply to graduate school or tried to be a historian if I hadn't had that kind of encouragement.
So let's talk about the publishing success that's brought you together this evening. You're the authors of these remarkable works that have been awarded the pinnacle of art's prestigious awards in American history and culture. When you publish a book that wins a Pulitzer Prize, how does your audience change? And how does the fact that you are the author of such celebrated works put a burden on you for what seems to be probably an exponential increase in your audience?
Well, I don't see my audience as having shifted because I always write for the widest audience possible. I try to make scholarly work, readable to a wide audience. But the burden does shift. I think it's incumbent on us to do outreach. I think it's incumbent on us to take our stories to the public and to introduce the public to a different telling of American history. something beyond the History Channel.
Alan?
Well, I think there's only been, I've given, since I won the first Pulitzer Prize, I'm guessing about 500 public addresses, of which 450 would not have happened if I hadn't won the Pulitzer. And in every single one of them, the lead is Pulitzer Prize winner. The one exception was there was this one very rustic town in Maine where they asked me to give the bicentennial address for the history of the town. And it was a town in which there were no paved roads. There was no hotel. I stayed with people who were hosting me for the talk. We lost power where I was speaking during the midst of it. It is the only time since 1996 where nobody mentioned the Pulitzer in introducing me. They thought the only book I'd written was about their town, which was my first book. But you do get many, and I'm sure Lil has this experience, there are many more people who suddenly become interested in your work because the name Pulitzer gets attached to you. My book isn't any better because somebody put the Pulitzer Prize on there. I'm not any smarter historian because they put it on there, but it validates you in the eyes of lots of other people who are then willing to listen to you. And so with that, as Lil says, comes an enormous responsibility that you have a chance to be a representative for doing history and for being a professor at a university at a time when universities are under all sorts of scrutiny and criticism, and where history is a harder sell than it used to be.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit, because historians often are fond of saying that any period under scrutiny in a class is a period of crisis in America. So pick any decade, and you'll find an historian say, well, America's at crisis then. So if you add them all up, America's always at crisis, and it just becomes a teaching convenience. That said, we were talking in the green room before coming out here. We're at a particular moment, as we always are, but we're at a particular moment in American culture where it seems like the perspective of history, it seems like the obligation of historians, it seems like the uses of history are ever more critical and ever more important to our society today. Can you talk about that either in light of your great success as authors reaching a larger audience, or just in the ways in which you approach your work? How do you approach getting your research out as part of an obligation?
Yeah, we're often asked to justify ourselves now in the academy, especially if you teach at a public university. We need to justify ourselves to the taxpayers. And I find that, in fact, it's often pitched in terms of job skills, that we teach reading and analysis and organizational skills and persistence and analytical skills, and that's all true. But to me, what really matters and what I want to convey to the public is that this is about the human spirit. Yeah, that you read good history and you come away stronger. You're better able to inhabit the present. You're restored somehow. And that, to me, is what the humanities really offer. And that's a job skill, but it's a life skill. It's something you carry with you forever.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that I love about Lil's most recent book is the sense of place. It's set in what we now call North Dakota, which turns out to be the very center of the North American continent.
Who knew?
Most of us who live on one coast or the other think of the big heartland there as something you fly over. But it changes your whole perspective. And Lil tells a story not just about the native peoples who are living there, but it's about how things happening thousands of miles away are affecting them, and how they are in turn affecting things that will go on thousands of miles away on either coast, and how the whole continent is stitched together. And I use this to say that I think what history does when it's done really, really well is it helps the reader to situate themselves. That gives them a kind of depth perception in time about where they are, where they're going, and how they relate to other people in the world we live in today that we all share, and how it was all created by people who are no longer here. And we have connections with them that we ordinarily forget because they're not here in our world today. But everything that we deal with is the creation largely of people in past generations. And so I think history does give us that depth perception of understanding who we are and where we think we're going.
So, as scholars of early America, with this great body of work already established in your careers, when you move through contemporary society in 2016, whether it's in Virginia or Colorado or here in Southern California, talk to us a little bit about how you bring your now, I suspect, intuitive knowledge of the 18th and early 19th centuries to bear on your world today. Are you living in the 18th century when you're out and about here in Los Angeles in a way?
It's hard to feel you're living in the 18th century in a room like this, a setting like this.
No, I mean, no, I don't live in the 18th century, but I think about it as I ride my bike. You know, I wonder how other people saw the same landscape that I'm looking at, and I let my experience of a place or anything else inform my writing.
Right. Well, I would say, I hope I'm not contradicting what I just said. The other half of the past is understanding how strange and different the past was from the world we live in. And that also gives us a sense of perspective. So there is this very tragic episode in your book where a Shoshone woman escapes, and it's the third time, and they cut her head off, and then people are kicking the head around this village just routinely. Now, that's horrifying, of course, but it's an episode that's not told to try to denigrate the people who did this, but to understand the place of violence in this world in which there was so much of it. And it's a very telling episode, I think, in there. And it reminds us that we're often, when we're trying to study the past, we're trying to understand people who may have lived in places that seem familiar to us now, like North Dakota. But it wasn't North Dakota in 1805. It was a different world.
Yeah, and while we're plugging each other's books, I think Alan's Internal Enemy resonates with politics today. This fear of enemies within the anti-immigrant sentiment. I mean, Native Americans and African Americans have in many ways been treated as aliens within, and this generates some real problems and potential, which Alan addresses beautifully in his book.
Do you find that part of your job with the platforms that your success of your work has built is inevitably to say to whatever audience you're reaching, this notion we have in American society that it's never been like this, that this is unusual in American society or unprecedented, do you find yourself in a position to say, actually, that's not true? We've had these moments in the past of excessive violence or internal dissension or the rise of demagogic political figures, et cetera. Do you find that oftentimes your role in the classroom or in your writing is that kind of governor on those sentiments?
I think we both would answer absolutely.
Can you give us an example from your work or from even your teaching?
Well, what I would say is the two common things that we hear in political discourse is we've never been so polarized in our politics as we are today. You've all heard that, right?
Yeah.
The other thing you'll hear is if we could just go back to what the Founding Fathers wanted us to do, everything will be fine. Well, I spend a lot of time teaching the world of the Founding Fathers, and they fought like cats and dogs. Half of them hated the other half. A few of them spent a lot of time shooting each other in duels. As bad as our politics may be today, and in some ways they're worse because I think the intellectual discourse has deteriorated from what politics used to be. But they're not more polarized than they were in the 1790s or in the 1850s or 1860s when we had a civil war. And I'm not sure the founders provide us with all the answers because they couldn't agree with things. They created certain contradictions in our politics that we're still living with.
Yeah. I absolutely agree with Alan. But we do this invocation of the past to explain the present, and the present to reflect on the past all the time. And when I teach the American Revolution now, I've often got Iraq War veterans, and we can talk about the experience of being an occupying army. A generation ago, people did the same thing using the Vietnam War. It's a discussion between the past and the present. When I teach classes on the history of epidemic disease, all you need to do is mention Ebola, and students think, oh, that's the kind of fear that people would have felt in an early smallpox epidemic.
Can you tell us a little bit about how each of you pursue your own work on a, let's say, an average day of research and writing? What are your conventions or your eccentricities, or how do you do it? You've produced this really remarkable body of work in a busy life.
Alan does it better than I do.
I don't know. I actually like to write, which makes me very weird. And I don't like to write when I start, because when you got the blank screen there, that's a terrifying thing. I have to fill this with words somehow. But once I get going, I like doing it. But I know it's crap. And I think for any of you who are aspiring writers, the most important thing you've got to learn is to write a lot of crap. But then know it's crap and edit the hell out of it. And you go through this multiple times before it ever becomes good. But if you sit there and wait, I've got to write a perfect sentence now, that screen will keep staring at you. So for me, what's best is if I can somehow clear my day of any other responsibilities. Now, there aren't many days when you can do that, but when you can do it, clear it of other responsibilities, turn your cell phone off, turn your email off, don't be tempted to clean the house or any of the other things that you might want to do. And then you can get some momentum going.
Lil?
Yeah, I'm not nearly as quick as Alan is, but I would say I also like to write. That doesn't mean it's not hard work, but I very much like to write. Unlike you, I write absolutely brilliantly, and then I go back and I reread it, and I find that it's crap.
Right.
So we end up somehow it works out. I find that I can only write in the summer when I have ample entry and exit time. It takes me a long time to figure out where I was, what I had in mind, what my sources were. I can't really get a head of steam going until the summertime when I can clear the decks and say, okay, no email till 3 p.m. And then I can deliver. But I need ample time to do it.
With The Internal Enemy and with the Mandan book, you both wrote about historical topics in roughly similar periods, but about historical subjects quite different from you. So in other words, Alan's focus was on enslaved people, and Lil's focus was on the Mandan peoples. Tell us about doing that kind of work as an historian and what reception it received from, let's say, the descendants of those people.
That was the hardest challenge I faced. I started off full of arrogance. I was, going to waltz into Newtown, North Dakota, and announce in tribal headquarters, "Hi, I'm here to write your history." And the book really stymied me. It was a very humbling experience, and the process of being humbled made it a much better book. It took me 12 years to write it, and that slowness, and the Mandan people themselves contributed to understandings that I would not have had had I written it more quickly. Eventually, I came to realize, what hubris it is to write history of anybody, even groups, similar to ourselves. It's still, the past is a foreign country. But the whole process made me much humbler, helped me listen. It was only when I started listening to Mandan people and then listening to my sources more effectively, thanks to their input, that I felt capable of even suggesting that this is ready for an audience to read.
I was at a conference that was, it was not just academics, but it was all sorts of people, including several people who were the descendants of escaped slaves from the period of the War of 1812. And I remember when I went into the lobby of the hotel, and there was this woman who was African American, and she had a name tag on that said descendant of Ezekiel Loney. Well, Ezekiel Loney had been the key person in this escape of 69 enslaved people from a plantation on the coast of Virginia. So I said, well, I've been working on Ezekiel Loney. So she had come to this conference hoping there'd been somebody who could tell her more about Ezekiel Loney, and I was eager to hear about whatever stories she had in her family about being a descendant of someone. And she belonged to a group, a distinctive group in the island of Trinidad, who, after the War of 1812, the British settled hundreds of former slaves who had helped them in the War of 1812. These enslaved people had escaped by stealing boats, go to these British warships, enlisted as Marines, became sailors, nurses, laundresses, were essential to the British operation that captured Washington, D.C. The British promised them freedom, and they delivered on it. But freedom was either in Nova Scotia or Trinidad. Those who went to Trinidad were settled in a particular part of the island together called the company towns. Each town belonged to a company of the Colonial Marines, which had been this regiment. And they became known as the Americans. Just take the word Americans, drop the A, turn the C into a K. And they retain this distinctive identity. And some of their descendants have moved to London or they moved to the United States. This particular woman, her family had moved to New Jersey when she was a kid. And then she had become the director of the art gallery at Clark Atlanta University, which is a historic black university in Atlanta. So we made a very nice connection, and she was able to help me to understand what I was seeing in ways that I could not have otherwise.
Amazing.
So let me just add to one of the things that I think is so special about the prizes going both to my book and to Alan's, especially your more recent book, the Internal Enemy book, is that it's a recognition of our work as historians, but it's also a recognition of a kind of history that matters. And it's a recognition, in this case, that African American people in Virginia in the War of 1812 really matter. Or Native American people. It's a prize for the Mandan people as much as it is, for this particular book. And I think that's a remarkable moment.
Yeah, it suggests that the history you do has a redemptive quality, right, for the topic and the subject, or even a redemptive rediscovery of people who've been lost to other types of history. Do you think the academic world that we write to in academia has as much purchase on that need as, let's say, the Pulitzer Prize, that is speaking to really broad streams and concerns in the culture? In other words, as academic historians, where do you think history is within the academy?
Well, I do think that we're the discipline that is still best positioned to speak beyond the academy, in that I think many more historians tend to write in a more accessible way, and I think there are more historians than in any other discipline with the goal of speaking beyond the academy. But there are all sorts of things that I think work against attention to history in our larger culture, which is very much focused on the now, and often there's an insistence that the past is the past and it's just gone. So, but I do think that we've got a chance, and I think there is a general curiosity out there if we can do a better job of addressing what people would like to know about the past. And I do think, as Lil says, people are much more open than they would have been 20, 30 years ago to understand in some depth the African American experience in this country, or to understand Native peoples.
Think so, Lil? You agree?
I do think so, and I think that the Academy has made great strides in counting the heads and recognizing who occupies North America and writing a history that reflects that demography. What we have done less well is to translate that history into stories, and I think that it's really stories that are compelling to the public. And, so I would urge my fellow academic historians to think harder. I mean, yes, we do write more accessible prose than many other disciplines, but we can still do better in conveying stories and why they matter in this new kind of history to a wider audience.
How high do you think the stakes are right now in 2016? In other words, you've both offered that there's been significant progress and we can do better. Can we also say the stakes are very, very, very high?
Well, I'm a historian, so I know that we've always been in crisis. But to me, yes, they feel very high now as majors in the humanities plummet.
You given the statistic from CU Boulder? About
You want me to say that publicly?
Well, you're in California. Yeah.
CU Boulder has lost 47% of its history majors in the last 7 years. And that's a trend that's nationwide right now. Yeah.
And it's not just in history, it's also in literature departments, humanities in general. And it's linked to the economics of how higher education is funded. I mean, higher education's become prohibitively expensive. The public does not, through state legislatures, does not invest in higher education the way it used to. And so the price goes up and the price is shifted to the individual and their families. And then families are saying, well, with this kind of outlay, with this kind of debt burden, you've got to immediately get a income stream that's significant. And that's pushing people away from the humanities, that kind of economic model of higher education. And I think we're paying a price for that in our larger society. I don't think any of that makes history less important. If we listen to our political candidates of whatever party, they almost always situate what they are saying about contemporary America in some story about its connection with the past. And a lot of what they say it comes as complete news to me as a historian. And I would like the citizens of this country to have the critical ability to listen to this and know when they're being told nonsense. And I worry that we're losing that.
Does your recent Pulitzers are quite recent, obviously. Is there a time scale to that bridge that the Pulitzer builds between your life and the public? Is there a period in which your connection to the public by way of these works will diminish? Or do you think you can occupy, as obviously just two voices, but can you occupy a conduit between academic history and the public because of these awards and the quality of your work for quite some time?
Alan can address that better than I can because I'm still riding the wave.
Occasionally very well-meaning people will say to me when I've got a new book that's about to come out, they'll say, was this going to win the Pulitzer Prize? And I assure them, no, it's not going to win the Pulitzer Prize. But it still might be a good book. I had a friend named J. Anthony Lucas who wrote this book. I'm trying to remember what.
Big Trouble.
Well, he wrote before Big Trouble. He wrote a book about the Boston
Common Ground.
Ground, and he won the Pulitzer for that. And then he went on to do Big Trouble. And then a mutual friend of ours, Patty Limerick, one time she also knew him, and he ended up committing suicide. And after this happened, I said to Patty, I know you'd worked very closely with him on Big Trouble. I'd worked more with him on the previous book. And I said, do you have any insights into why this would happen? And she said, in all earnestness, just sitting with me, she said, well, it was the pressure. He'd won the Pulitzer Prize, and he didn't think the next book would be up to standard. And then she looked at me, because I had won the Pulitzer Prize, and I was just grimacing. And she said, oh, but you wouldn't do that. So there is, I never expected to win it once, and there's a lot of luck involved in it to have a book at the right time where particular people on the committee are receptive to it, that you just can't expect.
How do you hear?
They don't, unless they do it differently for you. They just announce it to the press, and then your phone starts ringing off the hook. And your email goes crazy.
Yeah.
Same.
I got an email from a New York Times reporter that said, subject line was, congratulations on your prize. And I'm like, oh, I must have won a prize, And so I did what anybody would do. I Googled my name and prize. And I thought, well, that can't be right. So I walked down the hallway to a colleague's office and said, I walked into Martha Hanna's office, and she said she thought somebody died. And I said, Martha, you got to check behind me on this. And by the time I got to my office, my phone was ringing off the hook, and my editor had called my husband, not me. So,
So you talked about the presidential campaign, and whatever your political persuasion, whatever your beliefs about the ways in which political campaigns raise the stakes on truth and its bending truth, that doesn't happen all the time. You could weigh in as historians and scold the candidates and say that's not true. But of course, that would be just kind of episodic. If you had the chance to address the great needs for historical vantage and interpretation and the healing power that history can provide to a society or individuals at a deeper level, beyond 4 or 6 or 8 presidential candidates, what would you do?
What would you do? That's a tough question.
I'd go to the first graders and the second graders and the third graders. I'd go right there with the teachers, because the collegiate educators in the room were accustomed to this. There's oftentimes a great chain of blame that goes from those who teach senior seminars, who blame the freshman seminar teachers, who blame the high school, junior year and high school American history teachers, who blame the 8th grade teachers, who blame the 5th and the 4th grade teachers. How come they didn't learn what they needed to learn to get to my class? And that's completely wrong and backwards. They should all get together in the room. They should share the collegiate professors should share their research with the other educators at the K-12 level who share their teaching skills with the collegiate professors, and they should band together and work together on all this. We do some of that here.
well, and the first graders write the best, or ask the best questions.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because the first graders, first, second, and third graders are so thrilled that they can read that they've got an intellectual hothouse going on in their heads that's just waiting for you to give them good stuff to read. So that's what I would do. What would you do?
That's a great answer, Bill.
You have
We'll go with that.
anything else?
We'll go with that.
Okay, all right. In terms of your own practice as historians and the ways in which history has its uses in our society, one of the things historians do is fairly pedestrian, which is we bring insights from the archive with our archival and curatorial colleagues, like at this institution. We bring that stuff out into broader publics. How do you view that part of your job in terms of activating an archive and bringing the insights that you bring to the archive outward? So in other words, are you constantly thinking about how you approach archives and how you have loyalty to the archive as a place where you do your work?
We always have loyalty to the archive, but it's taking the archive to the public that's the missionary work. And that probably matters more than actually doing, I mean, you got to do the work, but that's what makes it matter, is taking it to the public.
So in other
And
words,
that is the missionary. Teaching and public outreach, that's the missionary
Right.
work of what we do.
So, for instance, pulling things out of the archive and whether or not interpreted by you, making those things available to others who can interpret them with or for their students.
Oh, absolutely. And interpret them differently than I have.
Right.
Yeah. Improve on what I've done. Correct me. Yeah, absolutely.
Alan?
Well, sometimes we get the idea that, not Lil and I get this, or you, the idea, but people who are new students at a university, they'll think history, there are a set of facts on some shelf somewhere, and we just go and pull them off the shelves, and then we put the facts in the books. And it's a lot more interesting, as you all know, a lot more interesting and more difficult than that, because what survives from the past is just some small fraction of the information. And it's all skewed. It's skewed because wealthier, more powerful people had greater opportunities for their information to survive, for their papers to survive. And it's a lot harder work than to push between the lines and to look for little bits and pieces so that you can reconstruct the experiences of the great majority of people, whether they were Mandan people or enslaved people or common farmers in rural Maine. And when you're doing that, it's part of the fun, the challenge is to figure out how you can take these bits and pieces and make a plausible set of connections. And I think that you can, and Lil does this wonderfully in her work, you can show your hand what you're doing with these bits and pieces of information to the reader and say, this is how I connect it. These are the choices I've made. And you're inviting them into the detective role of the historian. And I think that can be a very effective way. It's a particular way of telling the story.
Do you think we do that enough? Because I feel like I read so much history that feels so authoritative, and I think, God, man, how does that person have the confidence to know that? And yeah, I don't know. I wonder if we are transparent enough in all the uncertainty and in the sloppiness of the whole process of writing history.
Well, you're probably right, but I also think that at the end of the day, a reader is kind of hoping that you do feel you've got an authority over what you've read, that you're going to be helpful to them, that you're not just throwing the pieces of the puzzle out there, but you're saying, this is how I connect those pieces of the puzzle. So I think it's a balancing act. On the one hand, you want to show that I've made choices here.
Right.
I've made judgment calls. And you might not make the same judgment calls, but these are the ones I've made and why.
That's the invitation to the reader to become a historian in her own right, in his own right.
Well, and we used to do that through footnotes. In other words, here's the path I took. You want to follow it? Go look in box 7, folder 3. And that's a fairly passive way to invite your reader to interpret alongside of you. So particularly in the Mandan book, Lil weaves a third-person historian's voice with a first-person author's voice in that book. I mean, we see you in that book in ways that we're not really used to with a lot of academic work. Fair enough?
That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was, on the one hand, very honest, but also in the conventions of doing history, courageous.
Oh, it was scary.
Right.
It was scary. Yeah.
See, I would never do that because I'm not as interesting, and I know the limits of my readers. Right.
Quickly, before we turn to audience comments and questions, what are you both working on right now in your scholarly work, not your administrative work, in your scholarly work?
I am working on a biography of Sacagawea that uses her life story to convey a bigger history of the Northern Plains and Rockies.
I'm just putting the finishing touches on a book about the American Revolution. It's called American Revolutions, so plural. And it is telling the story of the whole North American continent as best I can, from about 1750 until 1804, with the political event we call the American Revolution is certainly there, and the East Coast features quite a bit. But it's making an attempt to argue that the entire continent gets caught up and influences how the revolution plays out. So I was dependent upon Lil's first book for a big chunk of what I was writing about, smallpox epidemic that affects apparently the whole continent right in the midst of the Revolutionary War. And I think that war was one of the things that was pushing that epidemic, that bringing so many young men and young women who were also in these armies together into crowded situations, and they'd not been inoculated, was an invitation for this to become an epidemic that would then leap through groups of people through the entire continent. That's not usually the way we think about the American Revolution, which is a very East Coast politically centered story. But the smallpox epidemic affected many of the episodes of the revolution that were real turning points. So I think that telling this bigger story involving all of the people in the continent will help, I hope, to see the American Revolution in new lights and see that it was many different revolutions.
Fabulous. So I want to end this part of the evening, before we turn to you all, with a note of real optimism. You filled this room tonight, which is wonderful. Congratulations to all of us, and thank you very much for coming to this discussion, which is, of course, the tip of the iceberg about the fate and future of the humanities. So that's great. I think you would agree that the historical profession, as long as we have lights of the field like this who can reach broader audiences with these magnificent topics and deep research skills and writing ability par excellence, the humanities is in good shape. With institutions like the Huntington, like California Humanities, institutions like the Pulitzer Prizes, we have the backing of very, very important bodies of very committed people, oftentimes with the funding streams that can support this kind of work. And one thing we didn't talk about in terms of the ways in which historians do their work, these are two premier graduate advisors who not only in addition to their undergraduate teaching, but they're training next generations of historians who will by definition enter a different kind of academy than one that exists now. It's changing every day, and they're training students to be amphibious and nimble about those changes. So all that bodes really well. But I think also to interject a hint of the fragility of all this, this is a fragile thing. The support for the humanities is fragile. The support for broad and deep and difficult ideas in history is fragile. We have to band together to support the engagement of ideas. We have to agree to disagree at times. We have to tussle in the most civil ways about ideas. And that's, again, what the academy and institutions like this and what you all are all about. So we have to agree to do that as much, too. So I want to thank you all. I want to especially thank our two guests for being here and thank all of our partners for the evening. We have a chance for a couple of questions before we break for coffee and cookies. There's microphones that will go around. But please join me before we do the questions in thanking Alan and Will. So there's, Aaron's got the microphone coming around. There's no such thing as a dumb question. There is such a thing as a long question. So, okay.
I hope this isn't a dumb one. As a retired middle school history teacher, I do worry about all the emphasis on STEM and STEAM, but there was a very interesting article by Nicholas Kristof, who interviewed a Pakistani extremist who had converted to a more reasonable position, who said his concern was that many of the terrorists had scientific backgrounds, and he worried that they didn't have the temporizing analytical skills that come from studying the humanities. And I wonder if we oughtn't to be emphasizing to a greater degree what real-world consequences there are in not supporting the humanities.
Great idea.
Well, I'm a retired engineer, so I'm sorry for that, but
But you're here.
I'm here because I love history. I began doing history where I worked. the departments of history are declining in enrollment. What's going to happen? Is it just going to go down and end, or what will bring it back?
Well, I want to say that I don't think engineers are our enemy. And I also don't think everybody, or even a majority of students at a university, ought to be history majors. But what I think is that a great majority of people studying whatever they love or they want to pursue as a career would benefit from taking a history course or two, or a literature course, or a religion course, whatever it is. That I do think that the people that have especially impressed me as scientists or engineers or people like yourself who want to know, how does this all fit into a world of human beings?
I also, go ahead, please.
Okay, I agree with the woman over here who pitched for educating the STEM kids, and for what Alan said, that engineers should take a couple of history classes. When I teach my history of epidemic disease class, I get pre-med students, and they're enthralled with it, dealing with the human dimensions of these problems. As for what's going to happen, I think we'll have another crisis that people will try to, they'll feel like they want to figure out, and they'll turn to history to do it. I don't know when that will be.
I also think that there's a dimension about this, actually this evening, that we should think about, which is it's Friday night, it's Good Friday, it's 7:30, and you're here. And if I asked my college students to join me for a lecture on Friday night at 7:30, they wouldn't be there, and I wouldn't expect them to be there. It's a different life, it's a different time of life, et cetera. But the academy, the history business, the history profession, we have an obligation. It's difficult and expensive, but we have an obligation to be of use and partnership for educating everybody. And if we can do more of this, we can actually probably do some good through all of us working together for the younger people.
I think perhaps you've already answered this question, but I'd like some clarity, and that is various people see the purpose of the study of history differently. Our generation and many today criticize history that it doesn't any longer bring a unity. The simplicity of history with everyone having the same culture, the same heroes is very important to bring this nation together, whereas they would accuse you and teachers who teach cultural, social history and case studies as being detrimental to that study of history, because you ask for diverse cases that do not fit into the pattern and do not clarify this wonderful sense of nationhood. I just wonder what you feel the purpose of history and the study of history is.
Well, I would say the American people are very diverse, and they've had many different historical experiences that have influenced who they are. I've worked with a lot of different young people, as have Bill and Lil, who, if you just want to give them a heroic story with a small cast of people as American history, it bores them. There's a turn-off switch. If you really want to reach young people, you don't want to tell them there was this never land of the past where everything was figured out and done by these demigods. You want to say, look, these issues about citizenship and who's an American and who's not, and who will own this land and who won't, and who will be free and who won't, these are very deep issues. And the world you're wrestling with is related to those issues. Then they perk up.
Who's count? Thank you. It's been a great evening. I heard a podcast today about the Pony Express, and it really debunked what we think of as this glorified FedEx on horseback or something like that. And it really wasn't very long, and it got, translated through stories. And when I heard you say, Lil, that historians need to do a better job of creating stories out of history. I'm wondering what anyone here thinks about the use of podcasts, which largely I would guess are not done by academicians, and to what extent that will help people stay engaged in history and learning about things versus maybe even creating more distortions.
Oh, I think it's fabulous. I think we need to use everything and anything that's available to get the word out. And multimedia is where it's at, so I am all in favor of it, yeah.
And I would just offer here at the Huntington, in the realm of humanities institutions, the Huntington occupies, with other institutions, a kind of special place because we've got the stuff. And the stuff, which is mind-blowing at this institution, deserves all the care and all the really curatorial love that it gets because it's so precious, having traveled through time to our time. But it deserves the communication connections in any form whatsoever that are appropriate to the material to get it out there. And so utilizing all those tools and techniques seems to me, like Lil, absolutely incumbent upon us to do that. Because, of course, the 11 and 12 and 13-year-olds, that's their world. Or the 8-year-olds, that's their world now. And we need to do more of that.
So we've been talking tonight about the use of American history, but we also, in this country and in this institution, have so much historical expertise that extends beyond American history to other countries. And I was wondering if you could just reflect on the use of non-American history for us, and does that usefulness feel different to you or look different to you in any way?
I think that both Alan and I do a version of American history that is unfolds in an international setting and that has no respect for national boundaries, and is deeply inflected by the kind of approaches that you're talking about. And I would say that I'm refreshed to see in our classes at CU, the interest is actually much higher now in global history than it is in American history. And I think that's a good turn. I do think it's important to learn American history, but the interest in the world is terrific.
In the middle of my career, I started working in Canada. And what inspired me was I was at a Western History Association meeting, and I was presenting a paper that was about American frontier experiences. And somebody in the audience said, well, what was happening in Canada in terms of this story? And everybody in the room thought it was interesting, and nobody knew a thing about Canada. And I thought, that's an opportunity. And it's been eye-opening for me, because Americans will often kind of think, well, Canada, they're just like us, only colder. And Canadians, I guarantee you, don't think that way. And it has given me a very valuable perspective to understand the United States better, from having spent a lot of time in Canada talking with Canadians, working in Canadian archives, reading a Canadian historiography, which is not all about us. It's a different experience to be in a country that has 1/10 of the population of the United States, but to be the next door neighbor to this superpower, which has all of this cultural power as well that influences their world and economic power. And so I do think, in answer to your question, that historians of the United States have had to become aware that the United States is not an island. It wasn't an island in the past. It's not an island now.
We have time for 2 questions. Jordan, I'm going to pick you as my prerogative to pick one of my graduate students. Just stand up and I'll repeat the question.
Well, as Professor Devereux said, I have the great privilege of studying as a PhD student under him at USC. So my question is, from your lauded position in the academy, what advice did the two of you have to a very junior scholar and his slightly less junior colleagues who are just starting out on this path?
You don't want to do it the way I did it.
My advice is listen to Bill.
One more question. I'm tempted to say why, but that won't be our question. And then as we break for coffee and cookies, our guests will be there too. So.
In terms of sources for history, since we're talking about the new generation who will have power after we move on, does the current generation exercise discretion in using the sources that they form opinions on? I mean, you can read anything you want to, and the question is, how valid and how accurate is it?
We have to teach that. That's what we do in our gateway seminars. You know, how do you know that this is a legitimate source? I think some of us have begun turning the page a little bit on Wikipedia, where I now say, yeah, you can use Wikipedia, just don't cite it, and use it to lead you to other legitimate sources. Yeah, but we have to teach this now. And it's not a new problem, though. Right. We have to do this with every source we read. You know, no matter who created it or what created it, it's the same problem that we've always dealt with. It's now in electronic media.
Well, we have the opportunity also to work with K-12 teachers, and in doing that, I'm sure I've learned more from them than they may have learned from me. And one of the things I learned was from one teacher who said, and had learned this from some philosophy of teaching, is that there's kind of a stage one where students believe whatever they see written. It's authoritative, it's text, it must be true. Then stage two is you don't believe anything that you read. That it's all opinion, and that all opinions are of equal value, or it's all equally untrue. And we're trying to help people get to a stage three where they are critical of everything that you read or you see, but you evaluate it. Some things are truer than other things that you see or read, and you need some criteria for evaluating so that you can make the right choices. And that's what we try to do as historians.
Thank you again for spending part of your evening with us.